The bills were soft from being folded so many times. 2 tens, 2 ones. I'd been carrying them in the front pocket of my grandfather's barn coat since the night I found the notice in his desk drawer. Not the foreclosure notice, not yet. That came later. Just a carbon copy survey amendment from 1987 that I hadn't understood at first. Then I did. I smoothed the bills against my thigh before I pushed them across the counter. The clerk, mid-50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a coffee mug that said, "Calhoun County, a great place to be." Picked them up by the corners like I'd handed her something damp. "Quiet title filing," I said, "for the half-acre parcel, severed from the primary deed in the 1987 survey." She looked at the bills. She looked at me. I was wearing a flannel that had been my grandmother's and boots with the left heel pulling loose, and I was 19 years old, and I was aware of all of that. The man behind me in line shifted his weight. He had a folder under his arm and clean hands, and the particular patience of someone who expects to be next. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The look he and the clerk exchanged happened just to the left of my face, not quite behind my back, not quite in front of it. That middle distance that says, "We are not being rude. We are just being realistic." I kept my hands flat on the counter. The clerk counted the bills twice, entered something into her terminal, and stamped a form with a force that seemed personal. She slid the carbon copy back toward me. "Processing takes 7 to 10 business days," she said, already looking past me. "Thank you," I said. I folded the carbon copy into the inside pocket of the barn coat, next to my grandfather's old chest pocket ruler, and walked out. Outside the glass doors of the Calhoun County Recorder's office, the Illinois River bluffs ran along the horizon like something that had been there long before any of this, and would be there long after. Gray-green, enormous. The kind of landscape that doesn't register you at all. The river was running high from March rains, a brown muscle through the lowland timber, and from the parking lot, I could see maybe 14 miles of it before the bluffs turned the view. I sat in the truck for a minute. The 1999 F-150 with 214,000 miles and a cracked passenger side mirror that my grandfather had never gotten around to replacing. I put the carbon copy on the dash where I could see it. Half an acre. Severed by a surveyor's error 36 years ago and never corrected. Legally, until today, belonging to no one. My wallet had nothing in it now. Not a card, not a bill, not a receipt. I started the truck and pulled out of the lot, and the bluffs held their position, and I drove the 6.2 miles back to Ridgeline Road. The carbon copy was still on the dash when I let myself think about the day it started. April 7th felt like a conclusion to something. The filing, the $22, the empty wallet. But it was March 4th that had actually split my life in half. A Saturday. I was in my dorm room at Southwestern Illinois College in Belleville, sitting on the floor with my back against the bed frame, studying for a soils exam I no longer remember anything about. My phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. I knew before I picked it up, not because I had a feeling or a premonition. I just knew the way you know that a branch has been cracking for a while and you finally hear it go. I sat there for one full ring with the phone in my hand, and then I answered it, and a woman from Calhoun County EMS told me my grandfather had passed at approximately 6:20 a.m., and I said thank you, which was the only thing I could think to say. I packed one bag. I don't remember what I put in it. I left the soils textbook open on the floor and drove 2.5 hours north and west on Route 3, which runs along the river, which means you drive with the bluffs to your left for most of it, and feel very small and very sure of where you are at the same time. I pulled onto Ridgeline Road at 9:53 a.m. The farm looked like something that had been exhaling for a long time and had finally stopped. 47 acres of frozen mud and brown field grass, the creek culvert at the gate half collapsed, the big walnut tree by the barn missing a main limb from some winter storm he hadn't told me about. The barn roof had a sag in the west corner where the water was coming through. I could see the stain from the driveway, a dark stripe down the siding like a bruise. The foreclosure notice was taped to the front door with blue painter's tape. Not even proper tape. Someone from First Bluffs Agricultural Bank of Hardin had driven the 6.2 miles out to Ridgeline Road and used painter's tape. I stood on the porch and read it. $31,400. Lien outstanding. 90 days to resolve. Notice dated March 29th. which meant it had been filed 25 days after he died, and mailed, and not responded to, because he was dead. March 29th was a Wednesday, and I had been in Belleville sitting through a lecture on nitrogen fixation, and the bank had already come and gone. I was 19 years old. I had $61 in my checking account. I had one bag packed for a weekend, and I had 47 acres of frozen ground in Calhoun County, Illinois, that belonged to me now, along with everything owed on it. I peeled the notice off the door and went inside. The house smelled like him, wood smoke and motor oil and something underneath both of those. Old paper, dry wood, decades of the same brand of hand soap. I set my bag down on the kitchen table and stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and then I made myself move, because standing still in a dead man's kitchen in the middle of March was not going to solve $31,400. I found a legal pad in the junk drawer. I found a pen that worked on the third try, and the next morning, when the temperature was 34 degrees and the sky was the color of old dishwater, I walked the property. Not a tour, a catalog. I started at the road and moved systematically, grid lines in my head, noting everything on the legal pad. The barn roof was worse than the stain suggested, 3 rafters visibly bowed, and when I climbed the loft ladder I could see daylight through a gap near the west peak. The east fence line along the road held. The south fence line, running back toward the tree break, had 2 sections down, posts rotted at the ground, wire sprung and half buried in the grass. I wrote, S fence, 60 feet down, minimum, posts gone. The well cap on the auxiliary well behind the barn was cracked through. I dropped a stone. Nothing. Dry since God knows when. I wrote, well, dry, cap cracked, useless. The tractor was in the equipment shed, a 1981 John Deere 4240 with a cracked manifold and a rear tire flat to the rim. There was a piece of masking tape on the steering column with his handwriting on it. Hasn't run since July 2019. He'd left me a note about it, just not one addressed to me. I stared at that tape for longer than I should have. I kept moving. The back acreage was rougher. The land dropped and rolled toward the bluff edge, and the grass was long and matted from the winter. I counted the fence posts along the north line. Several were leaning. One had fallen entirely and been left where it landed, which meant the line had been open for at least one grazing season, though there was nothing here to graze anymore. And then I reached the far back corner, where the property was supposed to end at a straight line running east. It didn't. There was a rusted fence post set about 8 feet inside what should have been the property boundary, angled slightly, not matching the line of the other posts. Nothing on either side of it. Just the post, standing alone in the middle of what I can only describe as a wall, ragweed 8 feet high, volunteer sumac thick as saplings, wild rye matted through everything like a net. The mass of it had its own stillness, a different cold than the open field, like stepping into a shadow that had been there since before I was born. I looked at my deed map. I looked at the fence post. They did not agree. I was still standing in the field when I heard her truck on the road. A dark green Chevy Silverado, clean, not a work truck but a farmer's truck, the kind that gets washed on Sundays. She pulled into the drive like she'd done it 100 times, which I suspect she had, and came around the side of the barn carrying a pie in both hands. Pecan. Still warm enough to show it in the cold. She was 71. I knew that from the county property records I'd been reading the night before. Her farm ran adjacent to mine along the east line, 120 acres, hayed twice a year, well-maintained. She smiled the way experienced people smile at inexperienced people, genuine, patient, and already somewhere else. We sat at the kitchen table. I put down 2 coffee cups. She set the pie between us like a document. She said she'd watched the farm for years, said she'd always respected my grandfather, said the land was good land but needed more than one person could manage alone, especially starting from nothing the way I was. She said she'd been thinking about expanding her operation for a while and had talked to her son about it. She said she could offer $48,000, cash, quick close, title company in Hardin, and I wouldn't have to worry about the rest of it. I let her finish. I drank my coffee. $48,000. The bank was owed $31,400. That left $16,600 to walk away with. No land, no barn, no root cellar, no morning fog on the river bluffs, Nothing my grandfather had spent 50 years building. She called it saving myself the trouble. I thanked her for the pie. I told her I'd think about it. She left the way she came, smoothly, without urgency, because she was certain I'd call. I sat at that table for a long time after her truck turned back onto the road. There was a kitchen drawer beside the stove that I hadn't opened yet, stuffed with the kind of accumulation that gathers over decades: seed catalogs, rubber bands, a flashlight that probably didn't work, take-out menus from a Chinese restaurant in Jerseyville. I pulled it all the way out and set it on the counter. Near the back, folded into thirds, was a survey map. Calhoun County, dated 1987, stamped with a surveyor's seal. I unfolded it on the table over the pie and traced the property lines with my finger. The half-acre behind the north barn had a notation in the margin, a tiny red asterisk. Beside it, in typescript so small, I had to get closer. Parcel inadvertently excluded from primary deed description. See attached correction notice. There was no attached correction notice. I looked at the survey. I looked at the fence post I'd found that afternoon, standing alone in the wall of overgrowth. 36 years. The Calhoun County Recorder's Office opened at 8. I was there at 7:53, sitting in the truck with the engine off, watching a man in a canvas jacket unlock the front door from the inside. The building was beige brick, one story, with a flagpole out front that had no flag. I had the survey map folded in my jacket pocket and $22 in cash, 2 10s and 2 1s, in my front jeans pocket where I could feel them. The clerk was a woman in her 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She looked at the survey. She looked at me. She asked if I had the parcel number. I had the parcel number. She typed something, waited, typed something else. The printer behind her made a grinding sound and produced a form. She slid it across the counter with a pen and told me to sign on lines 3 and 7. Filing fee was $22. I counted it out. She gave me a receipt stamped 10:14 a.m., April 7, 2023, and told me processing would take 6 to 8 weeks, but the filing date was what mattered legally. I thanked her. She had already turned back to her monitor. I sat in the truck in the parking lot and looked at the receipt for a while. The paper was thin, thermal printing, the kind that fades if you leave it in the sun. I put it in the glove box, under the registration, where it wouldn't. I drove back to Ridgeline Road with $0. The county extension office had a brush hog I'd seen listed on their equipment loan board, a 50-inch Rhino FP50 attached to a Kubota tractor, available to registered landowners for a 3-day loan. I'd called Tuesday. They said I could pick it up Thursday afternoon if I showed proof of ownership. I showed proof. I brought the Kubota back along the county road at just under 20 miles an hour, the brush hog rattling on the 3-point hitch, and I felt nothing in particular except that I needed to be fast before the light went. I started at the north fence line and worked inward. The ragweed went down in long brown waves. The sumac took longer. The stems were woody, finger-thick, and the hog chattered against them before they gave. I made passes west to east, overlapping by a foot, the way you mow a field you intend to keep. It was the 4th pass when I noticed it. The ground wasn't flat the way uncultivated ground goes flat. There were ridges, low, wind-softened, half-collapsed, but evenly spaced, 16, maybe 18 inches apart, running east to west at a slight angle to the fence line. The kind of spacing that doesn't happen by accident. The kind that happens when someone walks a row with intention. I stopped the tractor, cut the PTO, sat in the sudden silence, and looked at what the weeds had been covering. Someone had planted this. I climbed down from the Kubota and walked the rows on foot. The ridges were real, not a trick of light, not erosion channels, not the random heaving of frost. They ran parallel, evenly spaced, slightly diagonal to the east fence, the kind of layout a person chooses when they're accounting for afternoon shadow and prevailing wind both at once. Whoever laid this out had thought about it. I paced the length of one ridge heel to toe and came up with 62 feet. I paced another, 61. Close enough. I went back the next morning with a pair of leather gloves and a brush hook, and I started clearing by hand along the base of the ridges, where the hog couldn't reach without destroying the soil structure underneath. The sumac stumps were the worst, cut flush but still gripping the earth with lateral roots as thick as rope. I worked each one loose with a digging bar, levering until I felt the root system give. It took most of the morning to clear a 10-foot section. What I found underneath was not dead ground. There were shoots, dark red at the tips, almost burgundy, pushing up through cracked soil along the ridge crests. Not the pale yellow-green of weeds finding light, but the deep saturated red of something that had been waiting. Not one or two, dozens. Along 3 separate ridges on the east side of the field, wherever the sumac canopy had been thinnest, they were coming up in clusters. I photographed them on my phone and stood there in the cold for a long moment, not knowing what I was looking at. I spent the next 2 weeks finishing the clearing. Every day after morning chores, water, feed, the 3 goats, the chickens, 1 pass on the leaking gutter over the barn's south face, I drove the half-acre field and worked. By the last week of April, the field was open soil, the ridges fully exposed, running east to west in 11 distinct rows across the width of the parcel. By then I knew there were 2 separate plants returning. The first came up on the ridges, that dark red shoot thickening into a stalk, the leaves broad and slightly waxy. The second was climbing. It had found the sumac stumps I hadn't fully removed and was using them like posts, winding upward in thin spiraling vines, and where the pods were beginning to form, they were streaked black and purple in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost printed. I photographed everything: close-up, wide angle, the pod structure, the kernel color on the few ears already swelling, the root profile where I'd accidentally torn one loose. I organized the photos into a folder, wrote out what I'd observed in plain language: growth habit, color, spacing, evidence of previous cultivation, and sent it to the University of Illinois Extension Plant Identification Line on the night of April 29th. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and waited. The call came at 1:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was still at the kitchen table, still in my barn coat, and I watched my phone light up against the wood grain, and I didn't move for 1 full second before I picked it up. He identified himself as a plant specialist with the U of I Extension Service out of Urbana. He had a flat, careful voice, the voice of someone who has spent 30 years being precise about things other people gloss over. He asked me to confirm I had submitted the identification request earlier that evening. I said yes. He asked if the photographs were mine and if the field was on my property. I said yes to both. Then he was quiet for a moment, not the pause of someone searching for words, the pause of someone deciding how much weight to put behind them. He said the specimens in my photographs were not naturalized, not invasive, not random. He said the growth pattern, the row spacing, the pod coloration on the climbing variety, everything indicated intentional cultivation and old cultivation from rootstock that had been established long enough to be returning on its own after years of dormancy. He said the corn was a dent variety, dark pigmented, and the bean was a pole type with a very specific streaking pattern he had only seen documented a handful of times in 30 years of field work. He said I needed to look for paperwork. Specifically, he said USDA paperwork, specifically from the 1970s. He said if whoever planted that field knew what they were planting, and based on the evidence of deliberate row cultivation, he believed they did, there was a possibility those varieties were formally registered. He said I should look for anything with the words plant variety protection on it. He said it quietly, not dramatically, the way you tell someone to be careful on an icy step. I thanked him. He said he would send a written report by end of business the following day. The call ended at 1:22 a.m. The kitchen was very quiet after that. I sat with my hands flat on the table for maybe 2 minutes. The refrigerator cycled on and then off. Outside, a whippoorwill was going in the cedar line along the east fence, the same 4-note call repeating without variation, without urgency, the way it had been going every night since I arrived. I got up, took the flashlight from the hook by the back door, and went outside. The root cellar door is set into the slope behind the smokehouse, 2 wooden doors laid at an angle into the hillside, iron ring handles, paint long gone. I had been in twice since March, once for inventory, once to chase out a possum. I hadn't looked at it the way I was looking at it now. I pulled the right-hand door open and went down the steps. The root cellar smelled the way it always smelled: damp limestone, old wood, the faint mineral tang of preserved things. I pulled the door shut behind me and stood at the bottom of the steps while my flashlight swept the room. 2 walls of shelving, mostly empty now, a few mason jars my grandfather had put up, dates in his handwriting on the lids. A broken crock in the corner I hadn't moved yet. The floor was poured concrete, cracked along one seam, with a drain in the center that had been stuffed with steel wool against mice. I don't know how many times I had stood in that exact spot without seeing it. The north wall shelf unit was built from rough-cut 2x4s, painted gray at some point, the paint mostly gone. It ran floor to ceiling, maybe 6 feet wide. I had looked at it twice without really looking at it. Now I held the flashlight low and moved the beam along the base. There was a gap. Not large. 2 inches, maybe 2 1/4. A consistent gap all the way across the bottom, where the shelf frame should have been flush against the plaster. I crouched down. The baseboard behind it was intact. Original baseboard, same as the rest of the room. And along the left vertical edge of the shelf, where it met the corner, there was a line. Faint. Straight. The kind of line that plaster makes when something has been set against it and then moved, repeatedly, over many years. I set the flashlight on the floor pointing up, got both hands on the left edge of the shelf frame, and pulled. It moved. Not easily. The concrete had collected grit under the feet, and it scraped loud enough that I stopped, as if someone might hear. I repositioned, got a better grip, and pulled again. Steady pressure, not a jerk, and the whole unit swung out from the wall on the right side, like a door hinged at the right edge, because that is exactly what it was. Behind it, a section of wall, maybe 3 feet wide, a single wooden ledge, low, bolted to the studs, and on that ledge, an olive drab metal box. Military surplus, the kind with the 2 latches and the rubber seal around the lid. Stenciled across the top in white paint, the letters faded but readable. R. Calloway. I stood there for a moment. The flashlight was still on the floor behind me, casting everything in long shadows. I could hear the whippoorwill through the cellar door. The box was locked. A small barrel lock, the kind that takes a round key. I thought about that for a second. Then I thought about the nail by the tractor bay door. The nail where I had found the ignition key for the Farmall on my very first morning, and had been taking it down and hanging it back up every day since. There had been a second key on that nail. I had never wondered what it opened. I went back up the cellar stairs in the dark. The nail was where it always was, just inside the tractor bay door, a single square head nail driven into the wood frame at eye level. The Farmall key was there, the brass one on the split ring I used every morning, and beside it, on the same nail, a second key. Smaller, cylindrical, the kind of barrel key you'd use on a small lock with a round keyhole. It had been there since the first day. I had simply never asked the question. I took it back down. The box latches released with a sound like a knuckle cracking in a quiet room. The rubber seal around the lid had dried out over the years, cracked in one corner, but it had done its job. When I lifted the lid, the smell that came out was dry paper and something faintly mineral, like old ink. Not rot, not mildew, the box had held. Inside, set flat at the bottom, a book. A 1974 Farmer's Almanac, the cover worn soft at the corners, the spine cracked but intact. I set it on the ledge and opened it carefully. 3 pieces of paper were folded inside the front cover, each one creased in thirds, the fold lines still sharp. I unfolded the first one under the flashlight. It was a government document, formal typeface, official letterhead, United States Department of Agriculture, Plant Variety Protection Office, certificate number PVP 74000187, issued September 12, 1974. The crop, Bloody Butcher Heirloom Dent Corn, registered variety holder, Raymond Calloway, Calhoun County, Illinois. The second certificate was identical in form, PVP 740188, same date, Cherokee Trail of Tears pole bean, same name, both signed in blue ink, and countersigned by a USDA officer whose name I didn't recognize, both notarized, both stamped. The third piece of paper was different. 3 pages, handwritten, front and back, in the same careful print I recognized from the grain ledger in the kitchen. He had written it in pencil and then gone over it again in ink. I could see both layers in places where the pencil lines showed through. He had stopped planting that half-acre deliberately. He'd written it plainly. The rootstock was strong enough to return on its own, if left alone. He'd let the field go wild on purpose. He knew what was growing beneath the ragweed and the sumac. He'd been watching it come back. The last paragraph said he didn't know who would find the box. He said it might be nobody, but he had written it for whoever had the patience to clear the field before they knew what was in it. He had been waiting a long time for that person. I sat down on the root cellar floor with the pages in my lap and read it all the way through again. I stayed on that floor for a long time. When I came up out of the root cellar, the light had shifted west, and the field was gold at the edges. I stood at the fence and looked at it the way you look at something after you finally know its name. The ragweed was still there. The sumac was still there. But I could see where the corn had pushed up through at the south end, and I could see the beans threading up the old fence wire like they had been using it for decades, which they had. He had counted on this. He had drawn the whole thing up in pencil and then gone over it in ink, which is what I was going to have to do now. I went inside and found the Crooked Creek Heritage Seeds website on my phone. They were based in Galesburg, Illinois, 74 miles northeast, straight up Route 96. Small operation, family-owned. The website was plain and loaded slowly. I found a contact form and an email address. I typed a message that took me 4 drafts to get right. I attached photographs of both PVP certificates. I attached photographs of the living plants in the field, the corn at the south fence, the beans climbing the wire. I hit send at 7:14 in the evening. The response came at 11:02 that night. Short, direct. The owner said she would drive down in the morning. She arrived at 8:40 a.m. in a white Subaru Outback with mud on the rear panels. She was maybe 50, compact, wearing work boots that had seen actual work. She shook my hand and looked at the certificates without saying anything, turning them over once and then again, holding them the way you hold something you've been looking for long enough that you've stopped expecting to find it. Then she asked to see the field. I walked her out. She stepped through the fence and moved into the half-acre slowly, stopping twice to crouch down. She pulled a leaf, turned it over, pressed her thumb along the edge. She did not speak for 11 minutes. I counted without meaning to, standing at the fence with my hands in my pockets. When she came back, she looked at me for a moment before she said anything. She offered $14,800 up front for the licensing rights to both varieties, 9 cents per packet sold, ongoing, no ceiling. I stood there and let the number sit in the air between us. She said she understood if I needed time. She said she had been hunting these exact 2 varieties for 20 years, and she was not going to pressure me, but she was also not going to pretend she wasn't standing in front of something extraordinary. I told her I needed 24 hours. She nodded like she had expected that, handed me her card, and drove back up Ridgeline Road toward Route 96. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of scratch paper and a pencil and did the arithmetic 4 times. The lien was $31,400. The upfront offer was $14,800. The gap between those 2 numbers was $16,600, and I wrote it down and stared at it like it was going to change. It didn't. But then I wrote down 9 cents, and I wrote down the number she had mentioned almost in passing, roughly 190,000 packets annually through Crooked Creek's catalog and wholesale accounts, and I did that multiplication twice to make sure I was reading my own handwriting correctly. $17,100 per year. Not guaranteed, not written in stone, but real enough if the varieties performed the way she said they would. The gap closed in under 18 months. I sat under that single overhead bulb for a long time after that. The scratch paper was creased where I'd pressed too hard. Outside, the field was dark and I couldn't see it, but I knew exactly where it was. I called her the next morning and said yes. The papers came by overnight courier on May 17th. I read them twice at the kitchen table, then once more standing at the counter. I signed on May 19th, 2023, and mailed them back with a certified receipt. Then I made a second call. The loan officer at First Bluffs Agricultural Bank answered on the second ring. He was the same one who had sat across from me in March, with the foreclosure notice on the desk between us, and told me in a measured and not unkind voice that my best option was a clean sale. I had thought about that phrase for weeks. Best option, clean sale. As if the farm were a complication to be resolved rather than a thing to be kept. I told him I was calling to make a payment of $14,800 toward the outstanding lien, and to discuss restructuring the remainder. There was a pause. He asked me to hold. When he came back, his voice had a different quality to it. Not warm exactly, but careful in a new way. We worked out the terms over the next 40 minutes. The remaining $16,600 broken into a structured plan, manageable payments, interest rate adjusted. He did not ask where the money had come from. I did not tell him. When we hung up, I sat very still for a moment. The foreclosure notice, dated March 29th and counting down 90 days, had 11 days left on it. Those 11 days just became irrelevant. The thing that had been pressing on the farm since before I even got here, that quiet institutional threat running in the background of every decision, was gone. I folded the scratch paper in half and put it in my grandfather's almanac, next to the certificates. The field came in clean. By late August, the bloody butcher ears had dried on the stalk to a deep burgundy red, and the trail of tears beans had gone papery and slack, ready to shell. I harvested both by hand across 3 days in the second week of August, early mornings, before the heat climbed, pulling ears into feed sacks and stripping bean pods into a cedar bushel basket I'd found hanging in the smokehouse. My hands were stained purple-black by the second afternoon. I didn't mind. I left a portion of both crops standing in the far corner of the half-acre, the way my grandfather must have always done, seed for the next year, seed for the year after that. The logic of it was so plain I couldn't believe it had taken me this long to understand. Crooked Creek sent a courier on August 19th for the first certified seed transfer. I watched a man in a company polo shirt carry out labeled crates of my grandfather's corn and beans and load them into a refrigerated van. He shook my hand before he left. It was a business-like handshake, the kind that doesn't mean anything except that the work is real now. The main acreage I'm planting in winter rye and crimson clover, for the first time since 2017, cover crops. The soil here has been tired for years. I can see it in how shallow the grass roots run, in how the ground seals over after rain instead of drinking. It'll take 2 or 3 seasons to come back properly. I have 2 or 3 seasons now. I wrote 2 checks at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late August. The first went to First Bluffs Agricultural Bank, the third structured payment, on schedule. The second I wrote for $22. I put it in an envelope with a note card. On the note card I wrote, "For the pie." That was all. I drove it to the neighbor's mailbox the next morning before she was awake. She'll understand it or she won't. That's not really the point. Here's what I want to say to you, if you've made it this far. Something was planted before you were born. Maybe you know what it is. Maybe you don't. It might be in a box you haven't opened. It might be in a field that doesn't look like anything yet. It might be in the handwriting of someone who died before they got to tell you what they were thinking. The people who told you to sell, they weren't wrong about everything. They just couldn't see what was underneath the ragweed. You might be able to, if you're patient, if you clear enough ground. If this story found something in you, leave a comment. Tell me what's waiting in yours.